Today, we peel back the layers on a really seismic shift in global power, asking, is the transatlantic alliance we've known for decades truly unraveling? You might have seen the headlines just today, September 10th, 2025. NATO jets scrambled over Poland after Russian drone incursions, really sparking feels of a wider conflict. It's not some distant skirmish, it's right there, a stark reminder of Europe's security challenges. Yet, rewind just a few months to June 2025, a different kind of tremor. President Trump injected, well, profound uncertainty into NATO's core. He openly questioned Article 5, that mutual defense guarantee. The whole attack on one is an attack on all thing. Said its application depends on your definition. And he pushed allies hard toward a 5% GDP defense spending goal, even recalled past statements saying he'd encourage Russia to act against countries not paying their way. And look, this isn't just talk. NATO's own Secretary General Mark Rutte, he praised Trump for making Europe pay in a big way for its defense. The U.S. is clearly shifting gears, moving from direct aid to Ukraine to this alliance-funded model for weapons. It signals a really clear transactional U.S. role. The argument from this perspective is that for too long, American taxpayers have basically subsidized European security.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is how these changing American stances, combined with Europe's own, internal dynamics, are fundamentally reshaping the whole global power structure. This situation, as the sources we're looking at suggest, it really demands that Europe finally starts taking its own security much more seriously. So our mission in this deep dive is to explore a collection of sources offering a, let's say, pointed conservative viewpoint on NATO's future, American foreign policy under Trump, and Europe's path forward.
Exactly. We're going to extract the key arguments, look closely at the shifts being proposed, and try to understand the reasoning why many from this viewpoint think these changes are not just necessary, but frankly long overdue for the U.S. and maybe even for global stability. So let's unpack this. To really get where we might be headed, we kind of need to look back at NATO's foundation, but through this specific conservative lens. What parts of its early success are highlighted, and where did the critiques really start?
Well, from this perspective, NATO's first 40 years, say 1949 to 89, the fall of the wall, they're seen as incredibly successful, a real iron shield. It effectively deterred the Soviets, and some sources put it quite starkly, saving Western Europe from the menace of Russian Bolshevism. Back then, NATO successfully countered an estimated 1.3 million Soviet and client-state troops, poised right there on Western Europe's doorstep. Its role as a purely defensive military alliance against a very clear threat was, in this view, undeniable.
Crucial.
Okay, but then 1991 hits, the Soviet Union collapses, the Cold War ends. And this is where that conservative critique really kicks in, isn't it? The argument seems to be that NATO's original job, its whole reason for being, just disappeared. It became obsolete.
That's the core of it, yeah.
So the idea is that this post-Cold War identity crisis fundamentally changed NATO's role, not just geographically, but philosophically, from being a shield to maybe something else, a source of new problems. What was the perceived misstep? The concern from this conservative viewpoint is precisely that. Instead of adapting, maybe shrinking or rethinking its mission, the West, quote, turned NATO into a territorial aggressor of its own. It absorbed former Soviet bloc nations, pushing its borders right up against Russia. Think about it. St. Petersburg is now, within 100 miles of NATO? Moscow within 200? This expansion, the argument goes, deeply alienated Russia. It made NATO in its current form potentially a danger to peace, not a guarantor of it. It's a really fundamental critique of that whole post-Cold War expansion policy.
Right, and this critique of NATO's evolution, especially the expansion part, it kind of sets the stage for understanding President Trump's more transactional approach, doesn't it? What's the core philosophical shift there compared to how things used to be?
It's a huge shift. It moves away from, shared ideological solidarity, that sense of collective burden sharing, towards a much stricter cost-benefit analysis. From this perspective, President Trump has consistently questioned NATO's value. It's rooted in this belief that the U.S. has, quote, subsidized Europe's security for far too long. So his call for allies to hit that pretty hefty 5% GDP defense spending target for mutual defense guarantees, it reflects a very conditional approach to American protection.
It's basically looking at alliances through a financial lens, first and foremost.
Exactly, which is quite a paradigm shift for how global security has traditionally been funded and maintained, at least in the post-war era.
Okay, but this isn't just about America changing its tune. Let's pivot across the Atlantic, because Europe itself is dealing with its own set of challenges. A growing threat from within, as one prominent voice put it. U.S. Vice-President JD Vance, known for his conservative takes on European policy, gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference back in February 2025 arguing exactly that. What specific things does this perspective point to as Europe's internal weak spots, according to figures like Vance?
Well, Vance's argument really ties into that broader international right-wing populist narrative, the view that traditional European leaders are out of touch, they're not listening to their own people. And he gave some specific examples, as he saw them, to kind of illustrate this alleged disregard by the elites.
He did. He pointed to the 2024 Romanian presidential election, framed it as corrupt judges rejecting free and fair elections, despite evidence of Russian interference, mind you all, to the chagrin of its people.
Yeah.
It feeds that narrative about democratic processes being undermined. And he also implicitly criticized Germany's Brandmauer. That's the agreement among traditional parties to keep the far-right AfD out of government coalitions, which, from this conservative viewpoint, aligns with arguments saying, hey, maybe these radical right populist voices should be legitimized given a seat at the table.
And significantly, Vance directly linked uncontrolled migration to terror attacks. He mentioned a recent one in Munich, and basically blamed European elites for failing to handle these issues. He drew parallels to challenges faced by the American people, kind of strengthening this international populist connection.
So the implication is?
The broader implication here is that ideologically similar leaders, think Hungary's Viktor Orbán, who's always been critical of EU federalism, or Italy's Giorgia Meloni with her nationalist conservative platform, they're seen as offering potential for a new consensus. A consensus maybe with a MAGA flavor in transatlantic relations. This shift could imply more conditional engagement. Europe might find itself needing to align more with certain conservative demands, maybe even on domestic issues, just to secure continued U.S. support.
Wow. So it's not just about paying more for defense. It could be about ideological alignment demanded by Washington. That's quite a bit of leverage.
It potentially is, yes.
Okay, so given these internal European shifts in America's changing philosophy, what does this all mean for the bigger picture, the global power structure? This whole evolving dynamic has huge implications, starting with NATO itself. A reduced U.S. commitment is seen from this viewpoint as weakening NATO's cohesion, its credibility as a deterrent, leading to a, quote, less central and less significant role for the alliance. What might that actually look like, this less significant role?
Well, some sources suggest the idea might be to create a sort of dormant NATO, a situation where security burdens just rapidly shift onto Europe's shoulders. This could create a much more complex managerial burden because the internal adhesive, the glue holding the alliance together, would be significantly weaker without that strong U.S. commitment and, frankly, without the massive common threat we saw during the Cold War. That old Atlantic bargain U.S. ensures peace. Europe focuses on economics that's seen as rapidly coming undone.
And meanwhile, the U.S. is increasingly focused elsewhere, right? On rising powers in Asia, particularly China. Its defense policy is shifting focus away from Europe. Europe's becoming less central to American strategy. Why does that pivot matter so much for Europe's security?
That's a critical point, especially when you consider how China and Russia are watching this U.S.-NATO realignment very, very closely. Beijing, for example, might interpret this American recalibration as a sign of weakening deterrence elsewhere, which, in turn, could increase risks for, say, Taiwan. Some analyses even suggest the U.S. wants to focus on an economic war against China, maybe even trying to get Russia aligned in that effort. It represents a massive reprioritization of American global interests, and that directly impacts Europe's strategic situation.
So with America recalibrating, Asia rising, the logic pushing Europe to take on a larger share of its own security burden becomes, as one source puts it, ineluctable, unavoidable. Europe's being pushed, maybe forced, to really ramp up efforts for a common foreign and defense policy. Can you clarify the difference between Europe as a civilian power and this ambition to project collective power?
Sure. Historically, Europe's often been called a civilian power. Its influence was mostly economic, diplomatic. It relied on soft power, multilateral groups. The goal now, though, is to transform into something capable of projecting collective power using military means. It's an ambition to become a superpower, but not a superstate, meaning having significant military muscle to act decisively, but without necessarily becoming one single political entity like the United States. It's a tricky balance.
It sounds like a massive undertaking, and it definitely comes with a hefty price tag and some pretty stark realities attached. There was that Danish intelligence report in February 2025 suggesting Russia could be ready for a large-scale war in Europe within 5 years. And NATO's own chief, Mark Rutte, warned back in December 2024 that NATO is simply not ready. What are the immediate hurdles besides just the money that these sources point to for Europe actually achieving this kind of self-reliance?
Well, the money alone is staggering. To defend itself conventionally, without U.S. troops on the ground, initial estimates suggest Europe might need up to 300,000 additional troops and an annual defense spending boost of at least $250 billion. Now remember, Europe's defense spending in 2023 hit a record high at $279 billion.
So essentially doubling it. Wow.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That seems like a monumental financial lift, not to mention the logistics. And beyond the cash, there's the challenge of political will. Getting so many diverse nations to agree and act together on genuine strategic autonomy, that's historically been very difficult.
And then there's the elephant in the room, right? The need for a European nuclear deterrent. France and the UK have arsenals, but they're seen as insufficient on their own. From this perspective, American nukes are basically the only reason the rest of Europe is better off than Ukraine when facing a nuclear Russia.
Absolutely. It's a critical point. The long-term consequence highlighted here is that the conservative case isn't actually for abandoning NATO altogether, but for reforming it. The argument is that NATO should be reshaped to better serve American national interests. That means prioritizing political and strategic flexibility for the U.S., ensuring NATO doesn't, quote, encumber the U.S. when it chooses to act unilaterally.
Making it more of a tool than a constraint for Washington.
Essentially, yes. A tool in the toolbox available when needed, but not something that dictates U.S. action.
Okay, and there's a mechanism mentioned for this kind of reform, the Combined Joint Task Force, or CJTF initiative. It was endorsed way back in January '94. How does that help make NATO more relevant now, when not every threat affects every member the same way?
Right, the CJTF framework is key here. It allows for coalitions of the willing to form within NATO to tackle specific security challenges that don't necessarily involve all members' core interests. So instead of the whole alliance getting dragged into every single issue, smaller, more focused groups of members with shared interests can create a task force. This provides a really important layer of flexibility. It makes NATO potentially a more agile and relevant instrument for a wider range of security problems beyond just large-scale territorial defense.
And what about bringing new countries into NATO? Is the conservative view just no more expansion?
Not necessarily no more, but definitely a highly conditional approach. The insistence from this perspective is crucial. New members should only get in if they're genuinely willing and able to develop capabilities that allow them to actually contribute to operations both out of area and on the continent, not just signing declarations. This is seen as vital to prevent a dilution of NATO's overall effectiveness, making sure future expansion truly strengthens the alliance, rather than just adding members who might be security liabilities.
Okay, so we've really dug into a specific conservative perspective on this shifting transatlantic relationship. We've highlighted the changing U.S. priorities, the push for Europe to shoulder more defense responsibility, and the rising influence of right-wing populism in this whole equation. From this viewpoint, the NATO we knew after the Cold War needs some fundamental changes, and Europe is facing really critical choices about its own security, its own self-reliance.
Absolutely. And as America continues to recalibrate its global commitments and Europe grapples with these immense internal challenges, not to mention the staggering cost of true autonomy, you have to wonder, what new geopolitical fault lines might emerge, perhaps even within Europe itself? And how will all of this fundamentally reshape what we even mean by Western security for generations to come? Hopefully you, the listener, feel a bit better equipped now to understand these really profound shifts underway.